of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. Join us on our journey to learn more about the Christian faith and how we can live it out in our modern world. Can you imagine never being born? No. Well, then how can you desire it? Turns out there is a movement that desires this exact thing along with the extinction of the human species. But I'll pause there. Travis, over to you.
Thanks, Rigel, and thanks for teeing that up. That makes it sound, intense, and I think that is kind of exactly what it is. So, we're talking about the extinction of the human race, or those arguing for it on this week's episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. We are joined by Rick Clements to chat about this, and I'll introduce Rick here in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to use some of Rick's work to highlight this movement that's pushing for human extinction, basically, and that will frame the conversation. So to lead us off here, from Rick's article, which was recently published by the Word on Fire Institute, entitled "Be Sterile and Subtract," Rick says, "May we live long and die out. This is the motto of the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. This movement exhorts people to make a voluntary choice not to reproduce or not to give birth to any more children if they already have children, with the stated goal of bringing about the eventual extinction of the human race. The Voluntary Human Extinction Movement describes itself as a movement advanced by people who care about life on planet Earth, but its members obviously value non-human life far more than human life. Their website claims that Gaia would be better off without humans, and that phasing out the human species by voluntarily ceasing to breed will allow Earth's biosphere to return to good health. According to the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, human beings were once part of the ecosystem, but we became parasitic when we developed agriculture and started to exploit nature for our survival, becoming a virtual exotic invader of Earth's biosphere. The Voluntary Human Extinction Movement asserts that the morally correct and responsible choice is for human beings to stop reproducing entirely and celebrate those who have chosen permanent surgical contraception in order to not create more Homo sapiens." In case you're wondering, that's not made up. That is real. Rick has taken lots of that information right from this movement's website in writing his article. And so by way of introduction to Rick, I'll give a brief bio here and then we'll turn it over to him. So Rick Clements writes and speaks about the Catholic faith with a particular focus on rediscovering beauty, goodness, and truth. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology from Purdue University and a certificate in lay ecclesial ministry, and he has taught psychology at several universities. He is the author of two books, 2022's The Meaning of the World is Love and 2023's The Book of Love. He has also written articles for Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and Catholic World Report. You can find his work on his Substack titled Beauty, Goodness, Truth, and at his website, richardclements.org. So, Rick, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Looking forward to talking with you guys.
Well, maybe to start us off, before we dive into the craziness of, or maybe I don't know, I think it's crazy, but you'll educate us a little bit on this movement.
I agree.
Can you maybe walk us through a little bit about your background and then how you stumbled upon or sought out the information surrounding this voluntary human extinction movement?
Sure. The last year or so, I've been writing articles mostly for Word on Fire, and I kind of try to keep in touch with what's going on in the culture and what's going on in the news, looking for topics that I think will be of interest to Word on Fire readers and just a broader audience also. And so I look for a variety of sources of information on the internet, and I found this actually. I heard a political pundit mentioned this voluntary human extinction movement, and that was my first exposure to it. And as you said, it sounded rather crazy, and so it made me want to look at their website and find out more about this whole movement that they have started and kind of what their motivation is and what their goals are. And so it's kind of something I stumbled upon and wanted to explore more on my own.
So, Rick, I have to ask, this movement is it really a threat philosophically, or is there like an underlying symptom of the movement that's more scary to think about?
Philosophically, I don't see it being a huge threat, but I think there is a thread to it that ties into other trends in our culture. This at times hatred for human beings, for our own race. I see that happening more broadly in this movement toward being what's called child free. You know, there's been a lot written, a lot said about some people in the younger generations, 20s, 30s, who have basically concluded they don't want to have children, that their life will be better without children. And for some of them, it's this environmental sort of motivation that they think that this is adding to the carbon footprint of the human race and so on. But honestly, for others, it's a rather self-centered decision that they're going to be happier. They're not going to spend money on raising kids and so on. And uh, so I see the voluntary human extinction movement as having connections with some of these other trends toward a focus on self, and also this, I think, more harmful uh, sort of thread here is this hatred for the human race, and this sort of anger or even rage at the human race for the way they see us having despoiled the planet.
I am going to throw myself under the bus here a little bit because I think I would have been one of those people previously, definitely not today, but previously, I would have been one of those people who was way too comfortable with the idea of being child free. I would have advocated for the lifestyle that I was living, which was, the dink lifestyle, double income, no kids. So
Right.
two professionals earning great incomes, spending our money, basically in a hedonistic way, even if we were being generous with our money, supporting other people's children and everything. Certainly, we're not
Right.
open to having children of our own. And then I stumbled upon the Catholic faith, and it started a multi-year process that now has brought me to the point where I have polar opposite views to that. My wife is expecting our first child, and hopefully the first of many. I joke that I'd
Ah.
be happy with a baker's dozen, and and but I think that makes me an exception in our culture generally, being open
Mhm.
to a big family. I'm certain you know that all too well, Rick. You will see that, and you're touching on some of these things. This child free movement. Maybe before we dive more deeply into this voluntary human extinction movement, can you, for people who have never really thought about this idea of like a child free lifestyle or child free movement, what things are you seeing or have you seen in our secular Western culture generally that leads you to think this child free idea is both happening and that it's problematic?
Yeah, one thing I want to mention is that whole terminology of child-free versus childless. The term itself, child-free, has this kind of bias within it, and it's the term one often hears used out there, and the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement uses it on its website. But built into that language itself is this sort of bias against having kids. That if you have children, they're a burden. They limit your lifestyle. They impose demands on you that you would be free of, quote unquote. If you didn't have children, your life would be better without kids. So I just want to make sure I draw our attention to the language itself that carries within it this sort of anti-child bias. But there have been articles, this goes back at least a good 10 years, I'd say, Travis, where I think it was Time Magazine back around 2013 had a cover story on the child-free life. And they interviewed several people from around the United States. And, most of them spoke in economic terms, that they were going to be far better off financially if they did not have children, more freedom to travel, more freedom to pursue their career goals, and so on. So this has been, percolating in the culture for at least a decade, and I'd say more. And I think that pretty clearly a lot of it is driven by the sort of self focus that is so pervasive in our culture, advertising, uh, media, TV, movies, etc., that emphasize this sort of focus on your own life and achieving and obtaining everything you want in your life, and how children can stand in the way of that and be obstacles to that. Uh, you know, uh, this also relates to the whole individualistic focus in Western culture, the sort of self invention focus that we make our lives what we want them to be. We are totally the molders of our own lives, and to have children is an interference with that process.
It's interesting what you just said there, Rick, about this idea that we can create our own lives entirely, and this it's a measure of control, and I think that's very closely or intimately tied to other things we're seeing in the culture, including the gender ideology movement that
Yes.
Pope Benedict warned about, saw it coming, and then Pope Francis has repeatedly come back to about this idea that we decide who and what we are in every possible construct of our lives. And so I think this idea of a child-free existence is just part and parcel of this general idea that we are our own gods in some respects. We decide. No one decides for us. No one puts boundaries on it. We decide entirely. And so I like that you highlighted that there, because I think it's part of a bigger thing that we're seeing in Western secular society. Rigel, you had a comment that you wanted to make.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, Rick, Travis and I have worked for a company that managed a doggy daycare franchise. And part of the pattern that we saw was just people not wanting to have kids. They want dogs. And it's just this weird trend of, a kid you have to discipline, you have to teach, and, they still have a mind of their own. They can still do what they want, even if you do all the right things. But a dog is just something you command around, like unconditional love. Like it's a very self-centered focus. There's the self-sacrificial component is very much missing. I think there's also something about maybe a fear of commitment in there. A dog's life tends to be shorter than a human being's,
Yeah.
and so that plays into it too. And it's just a worrying trend overall.
Yeah, I think so too. I see that too. My wife is a veterinarian, and so she sees patients. Some patients come in, and their dog or their cat is treated like a child. And it's great to take really good care of our pets, but they're also not a human being. And I think there are people who have gotten carried away with the idea that a dog or a cat can be just as good, if not better, than having a child. And the lots of people spending lots of money on dogs and cats these days, and luxury accommodations for them, the dog or cat, while they go on vacation, and all kinds of treats and so on they buy for their dog and their cat. You see them treated as if they were children, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's where some people are displacing what would be commitment or devotion to a child. They're finding a way to have an outlet for some of that is not as demanding on their own life.
And where do you think that stems from, Rick? Like, do you think it's a lack of security or like an uncertainty? I mean, we have faith in God, and that kind of gives us the confidence to push forward with commitments and devoting ourselves to our children. But people that are lacking that, what is it that causes them to fear that sense of commitment and devotion?
Yeah, well, you mentioned a few minutes ago self-sacrifice, and I think that we as a culture have largely lost touch with the importance of self-sacrifice, in our family, certainly, and in the idea of raising children, but also sacrifice for the sake of the broader society. You hear a lot of people who are disrespectful toward people who choose vocations that are self-sacrificial, whether that be in law enforcement, the military, a religious vocation. These lines of work or callings in life that call for great sacrifice. A lot of people don't even, not only do they not choose for themselves to pursue that kind of calling, they don't respect it in other people choosing that. So I think, again, talking about cultural trends, there is a loss of valuing for sacrifice, and how necessary sacrifice is to build a family and also to maintain the culture. I'm a fan of Roger Scruton, a British conservative philosopher and political pundit, and he speaks very much about the importance of sacrifice, that you cannot have community survive in the long term without sacrifice. And I think that plays a big role in this whole, childless, child-free kind of movement.
And I think it also probably explains a little bit of the popularity of Jordan Peterson too. He very much touches on a lot of this stuff, in a different lens. But I think it's it's not accidental that in the process of the things that he and his family have experienced health wise, mental health wise, over the last 7 or 8 years, very publicly, his wife has recently converted to Catholicism, has come into the church. I reference
Yes.
them because they are from the same part of the world as I am. They're Albertans too. They were born and raised in
Hmm.
Alberta, a few hours north of where I've lived my entire life, and so they're talked
Uh-huh.
about very regularly. And I think Jordan Peterson taps into, with a lot of his work, about pushing back against this idea that living in service of others is somehow like lesser than being hyper self-interested and self-focused.
Hmm.
And so he himself, I don't think anyone really knows what his actual religious beliefs are, but I think he's in many respects very closely aligned with a Catholic Christian worldview on being in service of others, that it's not all about you, that it is about living for others and being in service of them and being self-sacrificial. That is part and parcel of the Christian faith. And so I think he taps into that. And I think people that are, and I have friends who are not Christians, but are fans of Jordan Peterson. And I think they see some of the things in our culture. And even if they can't put a finger on it, they kind of know something's off. Like they kind of know, surely living just for myself at the exclusion of all others is not the answer. The reason I say that is because I would imagine that you have some people involved in, whether it's the environmental movement generally or this voluntary human extinction movement specifically, who they would argue that they are actually being completely self-sacrificial. They would make that leap, that they would say, and that's why we're doing this. We are suggesting that no one exists anymore. We're being ultimately self-sacrificial. Now, I think there's a lot of steps in between there that they've skipped over to make that argument. So maybe, Rick, can you walk us through, insofar as you can understand it, uh, where did this voluntary human extinction movement specifically come from? Do you know who's behind it? And where do you see it going? Whatever you can share with us.
Yeah, there is I don't recall the guy's name offhand, but there is a guy in particular who started the voluntary human extinction movement, and his name is on the website. I don't recall it at the moment, but as far as I understand, that movement did come heavily from an environmental sort of perspective. That they started this movement with the goal of um, starting to heal the biosphere is kind of the language they use. And something you said, Travis, wanted me to make sure that I mention in here. I try to come at um, when I'm looking at where somebody else is at in their attitudes, their beliefs, and so on. And I know you guys do this too. Try to understand why they might think that, why they might believe that, and try to have some empathy for where they're at right now. And there are undoubtedly some of these people are very sincere and very concerned about the environment. But I would also say, of course, for some people who are looking to avoid the responsibilities and the commitments of raising children, it is sort of self-serving to be able to say, hey, look at me, I'm doing this, for the sake of the biosphere and the environment, and I'm making these sacrifices and see how virtuous I am. And so there can be a thread of that for some people, and to me, of course, that's a bit of a rationalization for your own selfish lifestyle. You can feel good about it because you believe there's, this higher goal that you're serving. And, again, some of the people are very sincere in that, but it is certainly self-serving for some people to see this commitment to the environment as being so self-sacrificial. In terms of where this movement comes from, I think that some of these people are looking for a way that they can feel like they are making some significant contribution to the environmental movement. So often we can feel like we're powerless. What can we do to influence these broader events that are happening in the world? And they see environmental degradation occurring, and what can they do beyond the obvious things? And so I think that's where some of this comes from, is that they're looking for a way that they personally can feel like they're making a significant contribution to protecting the environment. And their conclusion has been, carbon footprint. We are squatters, and we exploit the environment, and the environment will only heal when there are fewer and as they say, eventually none of us human beings.
I love how you phrase that, Rick, because something I've been thinking about since I read your article is how can we see this as a disordered good, as we say theologically, and I wonder if people in this movement are kind of seeing that we have been bad stewards of this planet that God has given us as a gift, and maybe they're seeking to be better stewards, they're seeking the wrong solution to the problem that we're facing. So in trying to be charitable, I feel like that could be the case for some people. Another story I kind of want to tell, just from almost an evolutionary perspective, and I know none of us here are evolutionary biologists, but when I was studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I was just reflecting on it. The base needs are food, water, shelter, the things that you need to survive. And it made me question, like, well, there isn't really a need for us to survive. We have a survival instinct and we have a reproductive instinct. And I mean, where do those things come from? So I went down a rabbit hole, just trying to figure out these things. And it turns out, like, people with a survival instinct, people with a reproductive instinct are the only ones that actually tend to reproduce and survive. Because if you don't have that instinct, you will tend to die out. And, if you parallel that to the animal kingdom, like there are situations where, animals will not reproduce if the environmental conditions are not favorable for their children to survive. And humans operate on a much higher level. It's not just like basic necessities that we're looking at. We're looking at future, like what are the economic circumstances, and what are the political circumstances even. And so it's just, I wonder if all this is playing into people's mentality when it comes to should we have children. Of course, we know as Christians, as Catholics, that none of these are considerations. Like, life is abundant and God will provide whatever we need. But it just makes me think that these are the things that people might be thinking about.
Yeah, you brought up a couple important points there, Rigel. I think there is this anxiety about the future. You hear some people say, I don't think I should bring children into this world. This world is so horrible and so on. And what kind of life are they going to have? Well, I think that that's something that from our Catholic faith in Providence, we trust in God, that sure, we all have concerns about the future, but we can trust in God's providence and things are going to be okay one way or another. There was the mystic from, was it like another name from the Middle Ages, the female mystic who said, all shall be well, and everything shall be well. I'm paraphrasing her, but that's what our faith teaches us. And I think for people who lack faith in God, anxiety for the future, is a tremendous factor. I think for some of them in making this kind of decision about whether to have children or not. The other thing you brought up that I'm glad I would wanted to make sure that we got to is stewardship. I think that this kind of movement that the voluntary human extinction movement represents, or is an example of, is a misguided form of stewardship. They you look at what's on their website, they care deeply, deeply about the environment and other species of animals and so on. And I applaud that, of course. That's all God's creation. But where they go astray is in this hatred, or at least this uh, highly negative attitude toward the human species. Why is that incompatible with doing good things for the environment and being good stewards for human beings to survive and thrive? Their viewpoint is this radical viewpoint that the biosphere will only heal when we are gone. That's when things will get back to this sort of, I mean, they almost use terms like Eden, the Garden of Eden will return when we're gone. Well, as you guys know, human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And that helps me have more empathy for people who join movements like this, because you have to ask, were they never, did they never hear that part of the gospel, or are their hearts closed to it? But when you see human beings as made in the image and likeness of God, how do you then join this sort of movement, or how do you become so antagonistic toward the survival of the human race as this sort of movement does?
Rick, the mystic that you were mentioning there is Julian of Norwich
Julian,
from
yes, thank
England, and
you.
you're absolutely right. Great reference there. Something that what you guys have just been mentioning, it makes me think about. So I'm working currently through an exegesis of the Gospel of Matthew, and specifically through the Sermon on the Mount. And this is where my used to be a Protestant, and now it's easy for me to blow holes in the Protestant worldview is going to shine through. So I apologize in advance to my separated brothers and sisters. But I'm Catholic for a reason, and I think this is where I highlight it. If you go through this exegesis that I've been doing, and I can put a link in the show notes, trying to understand the Sermon on the Mount, not just from our perspective today, which is a dangerous thing to do because when Jesus said these literal words, there was an audience there to hear them. And so trying to understand what he was conveying to that audience as well, insofar as we can, is incredibly important. And so in working through this exegesis of the Sermon on the Mount, it's very clear that Christ himself is highlighting that creation is, of course, incredibly important. But humans are in a unique position in creation. So yes, the birds of the air just trust that their food it will be provided for by God, but it is also made abundantly clear that humans are more important than the birds specifically. And so I think it taps into this idea that yes, we are called to be stewards of creation, but creation ultimately isn't there for us to be slaves to or servants of. And I think this is probably where this movement goes wrong a little bit. I would also imagine that we have many Protestant brothers and sisters who they would be shocked by this movement and stuff, and they would be completely aligned with us and how crazy this seems. But I also think part of the danger of Protestantism is if you give the Sermon on the Mount to 10 Protestants and ask them what does it mean, you get 48 different opinions, and all of them are equally valid. And I think any number of those opinions could actually be interpreted in a way that seems consistent with what the people who are arguing for the voluntary human extinction movement are arguing for. That they would highlight certain verses and be like, see, creation is good and we have poisoned it, or we have not been good stewards of it. And so I think one thing that I love about your article, Rick, grounded in a Catholic worldview, is it brings our attention to what is so often the case in the Catholic faith of it's nuanced, and it's very rarely at either extreme. It's somewhere in the middle. And so we
Mhm.
have to figure out a way, and I think Pope Francis does a great job of explaining this repeatedly. We have to find a way to ensure that human flourishing doesn't come at the expense of completely destroying the environment, but we also can't pretend like the environment is more important than the human beings that we were and as we are created in the image and likeness of God. So Rick, I know you're a psychologist, and so you'll have a much better understanding than we will of human thought processes and everything. You've also been an instructor in universities, so you're used to educating and clarifying thoughts. If you had to, how would you speak to someone that's trying to figure out where Christians should be looking at? Well, what is our responsibility for being stewards? Like if we're not parasites, but we've clearly gone wrong in some ways, what is the Christian perspective on this so that we can argue against those like the voluntary human extinction movement that think humans ought to be no more?
Yeah, your comments make me think of the Catholic both and. That Bishop Barron has written a book about that called Vibrant Paradoxes, the both and of Catholicism. And I think that's one way to approach the issue you're raising. This is an example where the Catholic faith says, yes, we are both the pinnacle of creation, but also responsible for creation. And as pinnacle, that doesn't mean we get to be totally self-centered and ravage the environment and exploit it entirely for our purposes. We are also the caretakers. And so there is that balancing where we don't degrade ourselves and say we need to wipe ourselves out for the sake of the rest of creation and these other species, but there's a responsibility that comes with being a member of the human race. We are meant to be caretakers. And so we have to realistically acknowledge that we have done damage to the earth. Industries that have wrought great destruction on the environment. There are all kinds of stories of industries where they've moved into an area and they've polluted the rivers and the air, and derived all kinds of profits and then moved on. And that's obviously a violation of what we are called to as stewards. And so I think we have to make sure, in discussing people who are members of movements like the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement or other sort of more extreme environmental movements, we see the environmental problems, and we know that we need to do better. But it is certainly not the solution to say we need to wipe out the human race. Just ground zero. We got to get all humans off this planet before the world can heal. I mean, that's such a distorted view. We also do good. There have been times where we have tried to save species. We've tried to do things that are actually good for the environment, that would not happen without rational human beings who could identify a problem and structure a solution that might help another species survive. So that's a positive thing that we bring as human beings to the survival of other species. I don't mean to sound too facile about that, because some people say, well, of course you can say that, but what about all the damage? Well, again, it's both and. You can't just say we are only harmful to the environment. Human beings have also done good things for the sake of other species.
One of the things you're touching on there, Rick, is actually an argument that was flying around, I think a couple of years ago, that I came across, where if you measure the carbon emissions of a single human being, it's a pretty significant amount. And so people were, using that as justification for why we should not have as many children, is because one less child equals X number of tons of carbon emissions reduced. And so something that I'm noticing about this movement is I don't think the philosophy itself is particularly dangerous just because it's so flawed. But what scares me a little bit is that people are selfish. And, like I understand selfishness and I understand anxiety. But I'm not condoning them, but I understand it. But as soon as you give a higher cause to those weaknesses that we have, it becomes particularly dangerous. We start justifying our selfishness and our anxieties in, oh no, we're pursuing this higher cause. That is honestly very scary to me, just because we know that we are so prone to that. Another thing that worries me as well, and this is mentioned on VHEMT's website actually. Elon Musk was talking about how a lot of environmentalists are actually extinctionists or extinctionists. Not sure what the word is, but you get what I mean.
Yeah,
And he was saying that it's particularly dangerous because if we think about the dangers of something like AI, if you think about the fact that a lot of the people who are training these AI models are extinctionists, well, you might run into a situation where AI believes that the extinction of human beings is actually a good thing. Now, a very real danger, and I'll put in a PG warning here. If you have children that are going to school and these AI models become available to the kids at the school, you might have an AI model that is communicating with your child that is telling your child that it is good to die. A
yeah,
very dangerous message, and it's just a very slippery slope that we're
absolutely.
going down, I think.
It is, and I think that AI is one of the bigger threats on the horizon, and you give a very good example of why it might be. And I think we need as Catholics to be as vigilant as we can be about the sort of influences that are going to come from that, and especially the influences they might have on our children and future generation coming up, to get those kind of messages. But you're also right to the point that some of these higher goals that align with people's selfishness, that's hard to combat. I think we're going to have to do some brainstorming, because it's self-sacrifice is kind of a hard sell to a
Yes.
lot of people. The message of go for what you want, grab all you can while you can, is of course, much more appealing to people than self-sacrifice is important and you'll find fulfillment and happiness in it. You will, but I think you've got, there's that step there where somebody's got to open up to that possibility. And this kind of takes me back to something Travis was saying earlier. How do people start to realize that sacrifice matters and that it has meaning and value? I think a lot of people, it has to be some kind of experience. It's got to be a firsthand experience. Maybe they notice wow, none of my friends like really cares about me. Maybe it starts in a little bit of a self-centered way. Like my friends, they all kind of go off and do their own thing. And when I need them, they weren't there, you know, and then they realize they're all focused on themselves. And maybe they start to realize, hey, I want friends, I want friendship to be more than that. So I'm just throwing that out as an example of how people might find a way in their own lives to kind of get toward the realization that sacrifice is necessary and important and even a good and fulfilling uh, aspect of life.
I love that you use those words specifically, Rick, that it's self-sacrifice is a tough sell, because VHEMT has like a frequently asked questions section on their website. And they specifically say there, there's a question, well, why don't you just kill yourselves? And their answer is, well, suicide is a tough sell. Now, having more kids, that's an easier sell. And I mean, I have no comments, but like you see the parallel there. Travis, over to you.
Yeah, that I don't know. I really like logic, and that I find that find it hard to reconcile that view with anything remotely resembling logic. Rigel, you mentioned something that I want to tap into because I was guilty of this. So you mentioned where the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement highlights studies showing the carbon footprint of every additional human being. And I myself, I think, I don't know when it was, probably 4 or 5 years ago, maybe not that long ago, but it was before I was a Christian, uh, highlighted that study. And I wasn't doing it as an argument to not have children. I was doing it as an argument, even though I probably could have, because I didn't want children at the time. I was super selfish, but I was using it as a way of poking holes. I thought I was poking holes in the arguments made by environmentalists who I'm like, this is the impact of the environment. If it's so important, then why are you having children? So I thought I was using this study against them. And now, here, fast forward 3 or 4 years, now that's literally what they're saying is they're being like, yeah, exactly. We're not having children and neither should you be. And so I don't know, I'm amazed at in a number of years where we've gotten to where I was almost trying to use that information against them to be like, well, that's inconsistent. And now it's like the movement has gotten to the point where they acknowledge it's inconsistent. And so they've taken it to its logical conclusion, which is, that's right, no children for anybody.
Yeah, well, and that phrase on the Vehement website about suicide's a tough sell, it almost seems to have the implication that if we could convince everybody, we'd get there sooner, right? If we could just convince everybody, commit suicide now, let's wipe out but they are
Exactly.
being realists, they say. But that shows the underlying, sort of view of human beings. It's like the sooner the better. But they couch it in these, the motto at the top of their homepage is, may we live long and die out. So they're even there, they're appealing to people's selfishness of, no, we're not asking you to commit suicide. You live your life fully now, but don't bring any more human beings into existence.
Rick, we're talking about extinction of our species. And that's a heavy, heavy topic. We also know, and I'm going to reference here, Lord of the Rings, which is my favorite novel or series of novels, however you want to do it. For those who have seen the movies and haven't read the books, read the books. They're infinitely better, and they are profoundly Catholic. You just don't know it,
Yes.
but they are profoundly Catholic.
And Tolkien
Yeah, it's one of my favorite novels too.
And one of the things I love about Tolkien's writing in those novels is that in the midst of profound despair and darkness and suffering, and when it seems like all hope is lost, no single hero emerges in the story. It is a bunch of individual people doing what they can wherever they're placed, small or big, but doing what is in their power to do. There was something profoundly Christian about that. Obviously, Tolkien was, as diehard a Catholic as it gets, and he infused that into this story about how no matter what we're facing, and in this instance, we're talking about people arguing for the extinction of our species. I, Travis Calloway, cannot stop that from happening. As an individual, I cannot stop that. Rather than be despondent about it, what I can do is argue for, no, I'm pro-life. And what I can do is influence those around me. I can be open to life. I can, God willing, raise children in the right way that makes fatherhood seem like an attractive thing to others who might not consider it otherwise. So I know that that's what we're called to. But I want to ask your view when you're trying to instill hope in conversations or living out your life, knowing that movements like this one are arguing for seemingly the opposite of it. What sort of messages would you deliver to people trying to instill Christian hope in them to offset the voluntary human extinction movement?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is really important, Travis, is you've got to focus on what you can do personally. It can be so easy and so tempting these days to be overwhelmed by just the waves of sort of bad news, right? And all the negative, like events, all the negative trends that are going on out there. But it's important to focus on what we do have control over, and that's our own life, that's our own choices. And I'm a big advocate of the concept of mission. I get some of this from Hans Urs von Balthasar, the Swiss theologian. I'm a huge fan of his, and he made mission very central to his theology. He sees mission as being central to what Christianity is all about. Each of us, every human being, is given a unique mission by God. And most of us, the vast majority of us, don't have some huge world changing mission, but we have a mission nonetheless. It's a mission of love, it's a mission that is part of Jesus Christ's universal mission of love. And part of our task in life is to discern what that mission is and to choose to live it out. And for many of us, that is parenting, raising children, being a force for good in our little sphere, our little part of the world. So that's the way that, for myself, I cope with all of the negative news and the trends that are very concerning. I have 5 children. And I, of course, think about what kind of world they're going to be in as their lives progress. They're 14 through 23 right now, so young adults to teenager, and I focus on what I can do, in my own little way. There's an image from Balthazar's work. He talks about each of us being a stone in God's mosaic. I really like that image. God in creation has, been sculpting or creating this beautiful mosaic of love that is the cosmos. And each of us has a little stone or tile to add to that mosaic. That's your mission in life. And if you turn down your mission, that little stone is going to be missing from that mosaic. And we're all called to contribute the beautiful mosaic of love that God intended the world to be.
So, Rick, playing off the theme of the mosaic and being a part of that, what is the message that we should be sending to young Catholics today? What are the things that they should be focusing on? What are the things that they should be actively doing today in order to avoid falling into this mindset or to avoid their anxieties? What can they do to overcome those things? Of course, we have our faith, but individually, what can they do?
Uh, yeah, boy, that's a really significant question. I think the answer might depend on the person. I think to find an area that they feel passionate about, that they can get involved in and feel like they're having some impact, because again, that sense that their life matters. I'd certainly encourage people to consider like the pro-life movement, or certainly getting involved in some sort of faith group. I just think that having some way that their faith is tangibly affecting their lives, and that they're living it out, and that they are in connection with other people striving to do the same. They're I think we're pretty good in Catholicism about community, and it's not just Jesus and me or God and me, but certainly in Catholicism too, people can think that as long as I'm praying and going to mass on my own, I don't need community. But I'd say especially for young people, connect, find other young people who have faith and hope, and that you can support each other in that. And Be careful about how much time you spend on, the screen, right? Social media, etc. And make sure you're seeking out some positives, because of course, so much what draws our attention, what people post is the negative stuff, because that's what gets clicks and attention. And especially as young people, I think that can create a a, a misleading view of the world, and like everything's falling apart. And so, social media and the internet, etc. use, you got to factor in, how is that affecting my thinking? Is it making me hopeless?
Rick, I know we're running out of time here, so I want to make one comment and then ask you for one final question. One comment, I think, for myself, very recently coming into the Catholic Church, having been raised in an evangelical Baptist household, the evangelicals and Baptists and many other Protestants, they get the community piece right. They really do most of the time. I mean, there's 40,000 Protestant denominations in the U.S., so I'm sure half of them are like abysmal and awful in so many ways. But the ones that I've been exposed to, they do great on the community front. And I'll be honest, there was a worry that I had before becoming Catholic that I'd be missing out on that. My experience has been the exact opposite. I have found significantly better community in the Catholic parishes that my wife and I are a part of. And so I'd say, for young Catholics, especially people that have been born and raised in the faith, so this wasn't a choice, don't take that for granted. It is a profound blessing. And I think in a society that is plagued with division, and Rick, you're in the United States, like it's political season right now, and we see the division everywhere. Like it's shocking in many respects. And we also have an epidemic of loneliness in many Western societies. And so I think all of these things highlight this need for community that we all have. The Catholic Church offers it, and so many people don't realize it. And so I think if you're listening to this and you're a young Catholic, take advantage of that. There are so many avenues within the church for you to be active, both in a way that benefits you directly and then also allows you to serve and be in service of others. It's amazing. Take advantage of that. I'm sure within your own parish, wherever in the world you are, you can find that. And then at the diocesan level. And anyways, it's so I really encourage that. I like that you had mentioned that, Rick.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Travis. And I would just encourage people, keep trying. Sometimes you might make one effort may not be enough. Be open, go back to your parish, multiple times, or go to the diocese level, but keep trying until you find that group that you connect with and that is going to be supportive of you and so on, because it's out there. And don't get discouraged. Just be willing to keep looking, and find that group that really encourages you in your faith.
Absolutely. Great advice. Rick, maybe before we wrap up here, I want to give you a chance. We mentioned it in the introduction, some of the work that you've done, the books you've written and everything, but turn it over to you. Maybe tell the audience a little more about where they can find you, the work that you're doing, but I'll let you do it in your own words.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. Yeah, well, I would certainly encourage people to look at Word on Fire. There's excellent articles on there. They publish a new article I think it's every day, Monday through Friday. And of course, they have videos, all kinds of resources on Word on Fire. And I've been writing an article for them about once a month for a little over a year now. So you can find some of my articles there at wordonfire.org. I have a website, richardclements.org. I just started a Substack, just launched it, and so there's not much there yet, but it's called Beauty, Goodness, Truth. And so, as you said at the introduction, I'm hoping to really look at cultural events, news, politics, life today through the lenses of beauty, goodness, and truth. And that's where Balthazar's influence on me, shows the most. And also Bishop Barron, as you know, very much an advocate of evangelizing with beauty, goodness, and truth. And so I have that Substack, and my two books that are out there. One is The Meaning of the World is Love, which is focused on Balthazar's theology of love. And what I did there was I pulled quotations from it, insights from Balthazar from over 60 of his books. The guy was incredibly prolific. And I pulled insights that he had regarding love and I put all these in the book, and I make comments on them and kind of integrate them. So that's the meaning of the world is love, and that's a direct quote from his theology. The other one, the Book of Love, also draws on Balthasar, but Benedict the 16th and John Paul II, C.S. Lewis, Thomas Aquinas. So what I try to do is some of those great thinkers, again, their insights of love kind of drawn together in a single book. So, hope people will check those things out.
Awesome. So what you're saying is you don't only spend your time thinking about the end of the human species. You're interested.
No, thankfully not.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Well, yeah, please, we'll put links in the show notes to your website, your Substack, and those sources, and encourage everybody to check them out. Really appreciate you joining us today. Rigel, do you want to wrap us up in a quick prayer here?
For sure. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we thank you for the gift of life. While things may not always be easy, that is not what we want. We want struggle. We want to overcome them and feel accomplished. Help us to find the strength within ourselves, but more than that, please walk with us in life. Give us hope when we lack it and strength when we need it. Through you, all things are possible. Help us to battle this culture of death which places no value on human life. Work through us so that we can turn people's hearts towards you. We pray all this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Hey, thanks so much, guys. I've really enjoyed our talk.
That's awesome.
Absolutely.
We hope you'll come back.
Yeah, would love to.
I was going to say, Rick, we probably just barely scratched the surface about the stuff that you could chat with us about. And so we appreciate you taking the time, sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And look forward to having you back in the future. To everyone who's listened, be sure to check out Rick's work. And until next time, this has been the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.
God bless.